Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Craig Hardesty, and I am the board chair of Out on Film, and we are thrilled to be here tonight to screen Lingua Franca, followed by a live conversation with filmmaker Isabel Sandoval. So welcome to Out on Film. Isabel, we are delighted to have you with us this evening.
Hi, Craig. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for watching Lingua Franca on Out on Film. I'm very thrilled to share the film with you.
Well, we were thrilled to be able to screen this before you go live on Netflix in I think a week, almost like pretty soon coming
Yes.
up. Um, one of the things that we pride ourselves on here at Out on Film is we tell stories and we showcase filmmakers and we tell stories about our entire community. And this, for me, was just a beautiful film about our community. And I wanted to just start with how you found this story or how this story found you, and why you wanted to tell it now.
Yeah. So Lingua Franca is my third feature film, but it feels like my first for two reasons. It's my first after my gender transition. And although I've been based in the US for close to 15 years, it is my first film to be actually set in and produced in the US. And I started writing it maybe a year and a half after I finished my second feature. And that was when I was also transitioning. Uh, so the changes that I've been experiencing were very much on my mind when I started writing Lingua Franca. And I was, more than halfway through writing the script when Donald Trump got elected into the White House. And especially those first few months were kind of, lost months in the sense that I felt, a lot of anxiety and uncertainty and vulnerability. I guess just like, other a lot of minorities at that time. And, that's how I channeled uh, kind of the emotional state and the mindset of Olivia, the main character in the film. And that sort of set the mood and tone for Lingua Franca. I mean, you already know the premise of the film, but I've also noticed that as a storyteller, I tend to gravitate to stories about women who are either marginalized or dispossessed and are forced to confront and deal with very private personal issues in a fraught socio-political setting or milieu. In my second feature apparition, these are cloistered Catholic nuns who, find themselves under siege and the eve of the Marcos dictatorship in the early 70s in the Philippines. And in Lingua Franca, it's of course an undocumented Filipino trans woman who's trying to find a path to citizenship in Trump's America while also navigating a burgeoning romantic relationship with a Russian Jewish man in Brooklyn.
Which I think there's a lot that you incorporate into this film. There are a lot of themes and a lot of issues and topics, and so we have identity and we have uh, gender and caregiving and aging and addiction and a love story and immigration, and 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 I thought that you just weave these together so beautifully so that each of these people has such a rich experience and we get to experience so much of their complexity. And I think that one of the things that struck me from the very beginning was this whole idea of caretaking and how it sets the tone that Olivia is so incredibly kind to Olga in the way that she talks to her, and there's grace, and she maintains her dignity, as you're saying, these women who maintain their dignity, and we don't always see that in a caregiving relationship. And I just wondered kind of how you came to that and made that like a caregiving a central theme in this movie.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, especially when you think of, Filipino immigrants in the US, majority of Filipino immigrants that move here, tend to find themselves in either, healthcare or working as home health aides and caregivers. And so, Olivia working as a caregiver and the situations, kind of her daily rituals are a composite of actual lived experiences of Filipino caregivers that I've either known personally as friends or have talked to. And, Craig, I really appreciate you mentioning all the, the complexity and the layers. And I think that's really the value added by kind of a minority filmmaker that's making or telling a story about the experience of minorities in the US. And it's because, as people, as individuals who do not experience certain privileges, in terms of race and gender, as you mentioned, that absence, is felt more acutely and more keenly. And so I'm, you know, I guess just naturally and almost unconsciously very conscious of that and cognizant of that in how I build the world of these characters and the characters themselves. I mean, I realized by being an other, in a country like the US, and I'm not just the other, like as, with Olivia being an undocumented trans woman of color, she's kind of a gold star minority. So, um, yeah, and so in that sense, the milieu, she doesn't live in a vacuum.
Right.
Her milieu is very clearly and precisely defined, socially and culturally and politically.
And her precariousness, which I think is was really quite interesting because this is ultimately a story about strength and resilience, um, in such a precarious position as far as her immigration status, which is really kind of what the central challenge is. And I would just say that, as an LGBTQ, film festival, and as we work on programming, it's really refreshing to see a film that is about a trans woman, but her transition is not the focus of
Yes.
this film. It is really, there is more to her story, and her precariousness of this moment is based on immigration and that fear of how your life can be upturned at any given moment.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I wanted, as a trans filmmaker, I wanted to make a trans film that started where a lot of trans films made by cisgender filmmakers tend to end. You know, there's definitely, and I guess every one of us who belong to the community have noticed that there's an obsession and fixation with the gender transition process.
Always.
And not that I'm saying it's not a valid, subject or a theme, but that doesn't encapsulate the transgender experience. And yeah, so in this film, her transition is barely even mentioned. It's a given, and we begin the film being immersed in the daily rituals of her life, just observing her in her natural habitat and engaging with the person that she's looking after, who's Olga. Um, so I didn't want to make a film that kind of pandered to the curiosity or the need for education of
We thank you for that.
cisgender people. Yeah.
It's just, because I have to say, it is just, it's wonderful to see that, as a filmmaking community, as people, we support stories that are different, and that, I don't want to say that we've moved beyond, but to recognize that there is a life in all of its complexity, of which this is a part, but there's so much more that we get to experience, so much more. I think is really, helps us ground as participants in the film. And I thought that, so I wanted to say thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
uh, and and I think kind of having said that, there is a perspective that you bring to the film. Like you said, this is not, and you know it's not made by a cisgender, particularly man, because you do have your perspective as a trans woman of color that you bring to this, and and as you do that, what kind of difference do you really think that makes as you're telling a
Um,
story, or for an audience to hear a story?
I think, as someone, who's that kind of filmmaker, I also made a conscious decision that I told the story that I wanted to tell. To build on what I said earlier, yeah, I'm not making like a film that's transgender for dummies or transgender 101. I wanted to, have a film where the trans character is not only the main protagonist, but as the central and emotional center of the film, feels three-dimensional and fully fleshed out. I'm not trying to portray someone who's saintly or perfect, but complex and flawed, who is allowed to be sensual and angry and frustrated, but also feel tenderness
Right.
and compassion and have agency, because it's something that I don't really see a lot of in mainstream cinema. If there are trans characters, it's either kind of they're the object of derision or ridicule, or sexual desire.
Right.
Um, but like in scenes of the film where we see Olivia being sensual, I mean, the first one is her sensual fantasy scene. I think there's something really radical and subversive about that, because it's not only about the trans female gaze. We're seeing her being the active agent of desire. She's the one desiring,
Right.
and not just the one being desired. And even in the second scene, where it's what you call, it's a love scene, it's not conventional in the sense that, these are just shots of naked bodies gyrating against each other.
Right.
For most of that scene, we stay on her face,
Hmm.
and we see her ambivalence, between allowing herself to experience that sexual pleasure, but also a kind of dawning anxiety and panic that she's becoming intimate with someone who doesn't necessarily know that she's transgender, and is afraid of one, rejection, and also of whether she's putting her safety and well-being in danger.
Right.
And so you see that character thinking, and yeah, I think there's just something really brazen about that. Like a woman thinking plus a trans woman thinking is a very powerful assertion of identity and
Yes.
personhood.
Right. And all of her humanity. I mean, like,
Yes.
I mean, her humanity, her emotions, her sexuality. I mean, it's all captured there, and I think, and kind of that brings us to Alex, Alex and
Yes.
Olivia, because they form this relationship. I mean,
Mhm.
they are, as the title suggests, they're creating this language between the two of them. Um, that is quite beautiful at moments. It's quite heartbreaking at moments. He does something really awful, and it's just but they get to have this relationship together and try to figure out how to be in the world that ultimately doesn't work out for them,
Yeah.
but they're getting there. So, and Alex probably should be the villain, but you don't really make him a villain.
Yeah. Which I think, in a certain sense, makes this film kind of unfashionable and anachronistic. But I like to think of myself as a humane um, filmmaker, in that, like, for instance, while the title may be Lingua Franca, of which a dictionary definition is bridge language, between two immigrants in the US, like a Filipino and a Russian person, they would communicate with each other in English, which would be the lingua franca here. But I use the term ironically, in the sense that what is actually most important between these two is what's left unsaid and articulated, of how words and language, fail kind of the complexity of how they're feeling. Like lingua franca is a drama of interiority, of kind of interior inward characters, who end up kind of keeping really crucial secrets to themselves out of a sense of shame and guilt, either because of how they were brought or the environment that they're in. On Olivia's part, it seems more obvious because, one, she's a transgender woman who's afraid for her well-being, so she doesn't tell him, but also, she's ashamed of being an undocumented immigrant. I mean, it's not something that you volunteer out in public, given the political climate that we have. And in um, Alex's case, he is very much a product of his upbringing, being Russian Jewish and growing up among, people who might a little be misogynistic or, homophobic and transphobic. And so they spend, the entire film, really, their art is trying to understand how they're feeling about themselves and sorting out those emotions. And in Alex's case, for instance, it's especially challenging and difficult for him to deal with those emotions maturely and responsibly,
Right.
um, and eventually to articulate them. I think like the climactic scene in the film, when Alex becomes emotional, Olivia doesn't really say all that much because, I feel like at that point of the film, like words for her are superfluous.
Right.
Yeah. So um lingua franca is kind of a tricky uh film in that sense, in that although it touches on social issues that are very pertinent and topical, it doesn't deal with them. It's not filmmaking with a bullhorn
Right.
or filmmaking with a megaphone. It doesn't deal with easy, big, loud, obvious emotions. It's trying to navigate into murkier emotional territory that's subtle, complex, even ambivalent. Because as a filmmaker, I would want the audience to come into this film not necessarily to have their own prejudices or theories reinforced in a straightforward manner, but to invite them to listen and pay attention and think more deeply and critically about characters like Olivia and Alex, the milieu that they live in, and the themes that the film touches on.
I was struck by two things. Uh, the scene where Olivia is kind of in the dark watching the ice raids, and,
Yes.
and he comes in, and she's almost at her most vulnerable in that moment, and she just completely breaks down because there is some measure of safety with Alex in that moment
Yeah.
before she finds out that his response is completely adolescent, but and he tries to fix that and ultimately can't. But that's a beautiful moment between the two of them when she's at her most vulnerable and he's at his most giving, I thought.
Yeah.
And it was just nice to be able to experience that, and then to later, as they're talking in the hotel room, and I love that Olivia doesn't explain herself. Why didn't you tell me? And
Yeah.
there's no need to explain herself, which I thought was such a wonderfully empowering moment. uh, and
Thank you.
letting him come to terms with his own struggle, and
Yeah.
let him do that. And we don't always get to see that where people are, you
Yeah.
know can it's often the trans person, the gay person, the lesbian who needs to make it better, and they have to come some catharsis. But I love that she didn't need to explain herself.
Exactly. And I mean, that scene is kind of divisive and polarizing in a way because it subverts, like Olivia's decision subverts, you know, the easy expectations of audiences who think she's going to decide a certain way, given the fact that she's a a trans woman and also an immigrant who needs papers. And it's at that point where, the film asks you to see and really understand Olivia more than just those, labels,
Right.
in terms of, her immigration status or her gender, but to try to put yourself in the shoes of this woman and why she ended up deciding going with a decision that seems one counterintuitive
Right.
and also, impractical. And that's when you realize that while on the surface it seems like one, a social issue drama and also like a romantic drama, it's ultimately about her resilience and her her yearning to gain back her agency and ability to determine for herself, her future. I mean, if she accepted Alex's offer, that would mean becoming married to a man who betrayed her trust and who exploited her at her most vulnerable. And yeah, I think for me, as someone who could very well be in Olivia's shoes, I don't think there's really any other outcome I could imagine.
Not, no, not one that would have been as satisfying as this one, because I, for one, saw this ending as so very hopeful. I mean, it seemed so hopeful to me that she made a decision, like you said, that was probably the most impractical decision
Yes,
for her circumstance, but one that was best for her, knowing that there is a cycle and that she starts this cycle again with the conversation with her mother, the with Olga, back in the kitchen, and we move on
yeah,
knowing that she just knows that this will work out somehow.
exactly. I mean, like you said, like the very last line in the film, which is not like in actually the last scene with Olga being back in the kitchen, but it's like recorded voice message of Olivia to her mother, where she says, "We'll get there eventually."
Right.
And her character says that in her native language from the Philippines. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, so it isn't the most, it isn't a conventional ending, which I think is really wonderful. But I just, it seemed, yeah, that the nature of hope and the resilience and the strength of making the best decision and choice for her, um,
yeah,
and not giving in, or compromising, even if it made sense to do so.
yeah. And it was also important for me to go with that ending because it's an it's an ending where I pull back from the story of this individual woman, Olivia, into the broader, situation of undocumented immigrants in the US. It remains unresolved.
Right.
But what's important is that these people struggle on, and continue and take it, you know, one day at a time.
I did want to say, Olga was wonderful. Is a wonderful character,
Yes.
and I wanted you to be able to talk about Lynn Cohen, who we lost earlier this year. She's wonderful in the film, and a lot of us have known her over the years in her career. How is it? How did she come to the film, and how was it working with her?
Lynn was the very first actor who was attached to Lingua Franca. We sent out the offer to her. She said, she met with me and said yes, right away. And she, it's because, her own mother, her own parents were immigrants from Ukraine. And she told me that, you know, this is a story that needs to be told. It's a story about these women like Olga and Olivia. When you think about it, who are mere characters? These are immigrant women to the United States who immigrated, who moved here at different points in their lives. And there's just a special kinship between those two women. And I actually have become friends with Lynn. We had met for lunch a few times and a visitor at her place, for a year before we started rolling. And so she's really just been a champion of Lingua Franca since day one. And she really added so much gravitas, not just to her role, but also to the film itself, as you can see.
I mean, she's really quite wonderful. I mean, the scene with
Yes.
Alex, and Alex is trying to take care of her and can't really do it, and it's just really, they capture that really beautifully,
Yeah.
with the two of them. Um, so the film is doing really, really well. I mean, you're getting lots of accolades and you're getting a lot of recognition. And now you're working with Array,
Yes.
Anna de Renee. Um, Tell us how that came about and kind of what that has been like as you get on this trajectory, I think, and you're going on to Netflix on August 26th, I believe, which is really fantastic. So what has this journey been like for you as a filmmaker and telling this story and having it be received the way that it's being received?
I'm just so thrilled and floored at the reaction that it's gotten. It had its world premiere at the Venice Film Festival last year, and it's been programmed in, I think, most major film festivals in Europe, and it's also had its run, in Asia and here in the US and Canada. It's just been surreal for me to have not only the film be recognized, but also to be kind of singled out as an exciting new auteur. Especially like last in July, the film was theatrically released in France in over 100 cinemas, and it got amazing reviews, and they like the fact that I have a distinct and singular sensibility and aesthetic as a filmmaker. And I'm very, very excited and grateful to be working with Ava and her distribution company Array, Tulane, the president, Sharon. It's it's just been a dream working with them, because not only do they amplify and champion underrepresented voices and talents like mine, Ava has also, told me and wanted me to kind of really celebrate my uniqueness as an auteur and my voice. It's very easy in this industry, especially as a minority, in Hollywood. You have to strike a delicate balance between representation and representing, the communities that you belong to, but also making sure that the industry doesn't box you in and pigeonhole you,
Right.
which is very, which can be very tempting to do. Like, oh, you're an immigrant filmmaker, you're a
Right.
female filmmaker, you're a trans filmmaker. So these are the only types of projects or stories that you can tell.
These are your lanes. Right.
Exactly. And so, yeah, I want to be able to represent my communities, but also blow the socks off of, the industry in terms of my possibilities as a storyteller and as an artist. Yeah. And yeah.
Do you think we're getting to a point with filmmaking in the industry and community? Do you find it's getting easier? Is it the same? Is it just as hard as it's ever been, particularly in our communities, to tell our stories, to get the financing, to get in front of people, to get the films made? Are where would you gauge? I mean, are you able to gauge kind of where you think we are at the moment?
Um, it's easy, I think, to get our foot in the door, because we are kind of having our moment in terms of representation, visibility, and there's been a push, in Hollywood for more diversity, but we have to also, you know, be very mindful and continue to push that it doesn't remain a token effort,
Right.
you know, and that we really need to, you know, not only be the creators, but to try to be part of the people that are making the decisions in greenlighting these projects. And, as an artist myself who's, currently trying to like navigate the next steps for me in this business, I want to be able to work on like big budget films, and I want the industry to see me as more than a certain type of filmmaker. So I'm also consciously choosing the projects
Okay.
that allow me to show the range of my talent and my ability as a filmmaker. And in fact, just very um, informally, I've just closed a deal working on a TV series that I'm developing. Um,
Okay. Excellent.
as a writer and director, and it's very different thematically from Lingua Franca. And I just finished a feature script that's set in the 16th century in the Philippines, for instance. So it's a surreal fantasy drama. Yeah.
Very excellent. Um, and I mean, this is what we do here at Out on Film, and promote filmmakers. But also want to kind of say how important it is not just to be in front of the camera, but to have us behind the camera as well. Like you said, in some of these instances, making the decisions, but also having, there's and being behind the camera too, for our stories to be as authentic as they can, to have
Yes.
to have that ability. Are you starting to see or experience that we're making progress there?
Um, to be honest, and
It's
it's
just
because and this is me speaking as an outsider. I think within like just the trans community, I see, of course, there's Pose,
right.
yeah, which is a groundbreaking series, and but there is definitely a lot more that needs to be done in that department, and hopefully, um, Lingua Franca will also kind of get my foot and the foot of other, trans Asian filmmakers in the door in the industry.
I hope so. Um, I- you have a voice that I think we need to hear more from. So I think you have a
Thank
lot,
you.
and
Thank you, Craig.
I hope that we get to hear it. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. This has been a great conversation for me, and for our audience. So I really want to thank you for joining us tonight, and I want to thank everybody out there who joined us tonight for the movie and for the Q&A. This is at Out on Film, we tell our stories. These are our stories that only we can tell, and we tell them for the community, so that we believe that everybody should see themselves on the screen and to be able to experience their life, both for validation and for not being alone and isolated. So I thank you for making this film. I thank you all for joining us. Please check us out. Our festival is going to run virtually this year, September 24th through October 4th. We're going to have a lot of great films, so stay tuned for our announcements. And thank you, Isabel, for joining us. And everybody, tell your friends to get on Netflix and watch this film when it drops in a week or so. So
Yes.
for joining us, and good night, everybody.
Right. Thank you, Craig.